Hello, and welcome to Shelf Life from the Virginia Festival of the Book. I'm Jane Kulo, Director of the Virginia Center for the Book, a program of Virginia Humanities. Thank you for joining us. A couple of notes before I hand the program over to our speakers. Please share your questions using the Q&A tab on Zoom. This event has optional closed captioning, which you can turn on and customize at any time with the closed captions tab at the bottom of your window. If you haven't already read today's book, we hope you will. For details about how to buy it from a local bookseller or check out a copy from your library, visit vabook.org, where you can also explore the schedule of upcoming programs and watch past events. While you're there, please consider making a donation to support the festival's ongoing work at vabook.org/give. Thank you to Ting for supporting our virtual programming. Now I'm pleased to introduce today's speakers. William deBuys, author of The Trail to Kanjiroba, also wrote River of Traps, a New York Times Notable Book of the Year and a Pulitzer Prize nonfiction finalist, as well as The Walk, an excerpt of which won a Pushcart Prize in 2008. In 2008-2009, he was a Guggenheim Fellow. He now lives in New Mexico. Bill McKibben wrote The End of Nature, the first book for a general audience about climate change in 1989. In May, he will publish his 20th book titled The Flag, the Cross, and the Station Wagon. A graying American looks back at his suburban boyhood and wonders what the hell happened. He is the founder, most recently, of Third Act, organizing Americans over age 60 to protect the planet and our democracy, and co-founder of the environmental organization 350.org. Bill McKibben is the Schumann Distinguished Scholar in Environmental Studies at Middlebury College and the winner of the Gandhi Prize, the Thomas Merton Prize, and the Right Livelihood Prize. He lives in Vermont. Thank you both for joining us for Shelf Life, and over to you, Bill McKibben.
Well, thank you very much, and what a pleasure to be here in virtual Virginia, joining from, it's a constellation of V's, joining from Vermont and from El Valle in New Mexico. Bill, start by just telling us where you are and what it's like outside today, and what that place, since we're going to talk about a long walk that you took in the Himalayas. Start by talking just for a moment about the walking around your home there, because it's been something you've written movingly about in the past, and it'll give people a sense for maybe just perambulation.
Yeah, well, thanks, Bill. And first of all, thanks for being on this program with me. And it's great to see you, and I'm very appreciative of your participation and of the Virginia Festival of the Book for having us. Yes, I'm in El Valle, New Mexico, beautiful downtown El Valle, New Mexico, which is a suburb of Las Trampas, New Mexico, along the Rio de las Trampas, the River of Traps in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. We're a tiny community in a pocket valley in the Southern Rocky Mountains, and it's a beautiful spring day outside, and the spring migrant birds are just beginning to arrive. So my first hummingbird of the season just a couple of days ago, the lizards have come out, and the chipmunks, and even a skink has made its appearance recently. And we're surrounded on almost all sides by Carson National Forest. So we have, about 500,000 acres of wild country to go rambling in, which the people in this community tend to do a lot, and me among them.
Well, having been there, I can testify that it's one of the beautiful places in the whole world. And greetings from the mountains of Vermont. We're past sugar season here, but not too late for a snowstorm, which we had yesterday, but it's melting quickly, and the skunk cabbage and the trout lilies are pushing up through the snow, and all is as well as it gets anymore.
Yeah, right.
Our planet. Well, so maybe that's a good place to start. at some level, um, this book is written out of a confrontation with the fact that our planet is, in the latter part of our lifetimes, under unprecedented, extraordinary stress that we never would have even imagined when we were young. Talk a little bit about your relationship to this idea around climate change, and then how it factored into this walk into one of the places that's changing more quickly than almost any on the world.
Well, I think we're hardly alone, Bill, in feeling a sense of deep sadness and often gloom, often anger about the situation of the world, which is, as you know better than almost anyone else, so avoidable as we go into this difficult situation. And I have felt that the sorrow, the grief, was cohabiting my alleged mind, along with intense delight in the beauty of Earth, and that these two emotions were like cellmates who couldn't get along. And that creates a dissonance, a moral ache that I needed to contend with. And in a sense, I went on not one actually, but two very long walks in the Himalaya with a medical expedition to try to find a way to live with these conflicting feelings, and also to find a way to stay focused on making things better, staying engaged, and not giving in to cynicism or apathy or despair, no matter how hard and how bad things appear at any given time.
In a sense, this book is the third in a trilogy, but I don't think it was a trilogy when you wrote the first one, I don't think you had the third one in mind.
I would never have had the nerve to do that.
Accidental trilogy, yes.
Yeah.
So talk about that a little bit, frame it that way before we get to the gripping story from Nepal.
Well, as you know, some years ago, gosh, it's now more than a decade, I did a book called A Great Aridness, Climate Change in the Future of the American Southwest. So that was a book about climate change. And almost the very day I sent off the final manuscript to the publisher of that book, I started packing for a wildlife expedition in Lao PDR, the Lao People's Democratic Republic, a country we call Laos, usually in the United States. And in Laos, I saw close up humanity's war against wildlife, and it was very disturbing. So that produced a book called The Last Unicorn, a search for one of Earth's rarest creatures. And that book is fundamentally about the loss of biodiversity. And so with climate change and the grief of the war on wildlife in my mental knapsack, I was kind of messed up. And I didn't realize it, as you say, it was an accidental trilogy, but this book, The Trail to Kanjiroba, became the book of how to look at the facts of Earth's situation, look at them straight on, and still keep going. And so in that sense, it completes those other two books. And it was a completely accidental connection, in the sense that I never would have had the gall to undertake such a big project at the outset.
Well, describe for people, describe this was an expedition arranged under the auspices of San Francisco Buddhists to a Buddhist part of the world. and it included a number of Western medical professionals, but also people practicing more traditional medicine. Just tell us what was a day like, and day to day, how did it go? Just give us a sense of both the landscape and the routine and what you saw as you were out there.
We were a sort of small town on the hoof. We had probably 20 or 25 different medicos. We had a number of Buddhist priests, and the medicos were both Nepali and Western. We had a couple score of camp tenders and muleteers, and we had up to 70 or 80 mules at any given time. We covered in 6 weeks about 150 miles, and that included 5 passes higher than 17,000 feet. And so we would travel on these narrow cliffside trails for most of the day, make camp, travel again and get to a village and set up a clinic and provide primary medical services to people who rarely or never see a clinician. And then rinse and repeat over another pass, another village, and on through some of the most spectacular and beautiful landscape on planet Earth.
What kind of complaints? Did you up or did I?
I'm sorry, the transmission failed for a moment there. Could you repeat?
Did I? Can you hear me now?
I can. Oops.
What kind of people arriving with?
What kind of people? I've lost you again.
Hello?
Yeah, I lost you again there, Bill. Didn't hear your question.
I'm sorry. I was just wondering what kind of complaints people were arriving with when they came to the clinic.
Oh, so many of we had the full range. There is a bacterium that is epidemic in that area that creates ulcerous and digestive problems. Many people, especially the women, were suffering from severe arthritic pain in knees and hips because they're going up and down steep slopes, carrying heavy loads all their lives. There was a lot of respiratory trouble from having lived in unchimneyed homes that are heated with yak dung fires, and that's also the source for cooking. And so a lot of respiratory problems from all those particulates. So the spectrum, really.
One of the things you mentioned that I thought was interesting was that when doctors told people that there wasn't much they could do for them, they just left as you said, as cheerful as they had come in. That there was sort of less of the kind of expectation that a doctor would be able to fix everything than perhaps you encounter in a clinic in the US.
Absolutely. And I think everyone involved in the expedition found that the cheerful stoicism of the Nepali villagers, who were ethnically Tibetan, by the way, the stoicism of these villagers was truly inspiring. Some of the doctors would comment that when in their American clinics, people would come to them and seem to have a desire for something to be fixed that went beyond their hypertension or beyond their physical ailment, that they wanted some kind of medicine for their soul. these docs didn't find that with the Tibetan people we were treating. In fact, they made us feel better when they came to the clinic.
I should just note in passing to get your response to, I mean, since we're here at the Festival of the Book, you were tramping in place with a literary pedigree as well. There was another great American writer who went there in search of his own unicorn, as it were, Peter Matheson, in one of the absolute classic accounts of a journey in our literature. Did you read Matheson before you went, and did it echo a little bit in your head?
Well, I read Matheson when it came out back in 1973. I carried Matheson. I carried the snow leopard in my pack through the forest, the jungle in Laos on that expedition. And I had it in my duffel in the Himalaya as well. That is one of the greatest books I know. And it was kind of thrilling to be on the same trails that Peter and George Schaller, who is perhaps the greatest wildlife biologist on our planet today, certainly an inspiration to people in that profession for decades and decades. And George, so that listeners know, George was the wildlife biologist that dragged Peter Matheson along on the journey that became the book, The Snow Leopard. And George was actually on a return trip to Dolpo, to this region of Nepal, when we were there in 2016.
Huh. That's interesting. I haven't seen him in a long time, and that's I'm glad to know he was up and about in the mountains. So talk for a minute about we'll return to the story of the trip through the mountains, but there are two other strands. I mean, there's a strong metaphysical strand that runs through some of that, but there's a very strong physical science thread that runs through this book too. Actually, two of them: meditations on Darwin and meditations on plate tectonics. Two of the remarkable intellectual revolutions in the last 2 centuries in our thinking about the world. So how did they creep into this?
Well, for 2 reasons. One was I wanted this book to be a celebration of the beauty of Earth, as well as a meditation on our environmental problems. And for me, I don't think this applies to everyone, but for me, science opens the doors of wonder. The more we understand how living systems work and how the planet works, the deeper we can get into perceiving the complexity of the marvelousness of the world, the more beauty unfolds for us, I believe. So that's one reason. But there's a second reason, and that is that you and I, Bill, are among the first generation of human beings in the whole history of our species who have been able to tell ourselves the story of our planet and of our species without resorting to magic. Plate tectonics developed and was accepted as a unifying theory of earth science when you and I were in grade school.
Yep.
And so we are among the first, and the corresponding theory in the biological sciences is, of course, Darwin's theory of natural selection. So in this book, I tried to twine the journeys, as I say, the narrative hitchhikes along on the HMS Beagle on Darwin's journey of discovery, and it also hitchhikes along on the journey of the revelation of plate tectonics.
Well, you were certainly if there was any place in the world where plate tectonics upthrust and uh, so on are on dramatic display. It's either where you were or Hawaii, I guess. Um,
Yeah.
and so that must have been um, quite a powerful companion to have all that time. This
It
sense of
was, and
being
it,
able to
it
work.
was just amazing to see the rawness of the land, these vast mountainsides of brand new, unoxidized rock that had been revealed to the atmosphere just within the last 100 years or so. This is such a living landscape. To get a glimpse of plate tectonics in the Himalaya, all I had to do was stick my head out of the tent.
And of course, now there's a force as powerful as plate tectonics at work, shaping our planet as well, and that's the rapid rise in its temperature.
Yeah.
Again, few places on Earth is it more visible than at what we've taken to calling the third pole there in the Himalayas. What were you seeing?
Well, we were seeing places where the hydrology of rivers, the patterns of irrigation had changed markedly, and where people were struggling to be able to maintain their, believe it or not, at that altitude, irrigation is vital to bringing in a barley crop. And with the alternate flooding or mistiming of the rains, that had become more and more difficult for people. And people reported that avalanches were occurring in places where avalanches had never occurred, things of that sort. And of course, the explanation for what caused those changes was sometimes scientific, and sometimes it was, oh, there are too many outsiders coming in who don't respect the local spirits of place. But it was a landscape in a sort of quiet turmoil of constant change.
I remember being in Tibet and talking with a young man about who was describing the retreat of the glacier up his valley and things. And this was in a very, very, very remote part of the world with almost no one there. But I said to him at one point, "So what do you think's causing this to happen?" And he just looked at me like I was a moron and said, "Too many factories, too many cars." I was like, "Yeah, okay,
Yeah.
I've heard that before." But but there was also in your description people blaming outsiders coming in, which may not be exactly physically accurate, but it's sort of spiritually accurate at some
It is.
at some level.
It's the activity of those outsiders, and in that part of Nepal, as throughout the world, the people who will suffer most grievously from the changing climate will be those who contributed to it the least.
Yes, the average carbon emissions of someone living in those valleys are essentially nil.
Almost nil, yeah, absolutely.
By the way, reminding people listening in that you should add your questions. I don't want to monopolize the question asking here, and so that's why Zoom has thoughtfully provided this Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. So if you have a question, that's the place to put it in, and I will pose it to Bill. So one of the images that you work with here in response to the fact that you're on a medical expedition, but in response to the kind of grief that we feel as climate change proceeds, is this image of hospice and hospice care as one way to think about how we deal with the facts around us, which is very different from the kind of emergency room care that most of us spend most of our time working on if we're dealing with climate change, trying to figure out how to keep the patient from going over the edge and so on. Talk about that a little bit, because I think it's such an interesting way of thinking about it.
Well, this was one of the reasons I went on the trip. The kind of medicine we practiced, we didn't have X-ray machines. We couldn't do blood work. We couldn't, certainly couldn't do surgery, couldn't prescribe long-term pharmaceutical therapies, things of that sort. We had to focus on the here and now and deliver our medicine, our medical care the old-fashioned way. And our leader, Roshi Joan Halifax, emphasized that we needed to prioritize care over cure. We needed to avoid getting too attached to outcomes. We needed to have a strong back and a soft front as we confronted each problem. These are also, they happen to be the ethics of hospice care. We needed not to focus on fixing things, but on making the present as good as possible. And the metaphor of hospice is imperfect, to be sure. When you say hospice for Earth, people think, oh, but Earth is not dying. And that's absolutely true. Earth will continue to produce marvelous forms of life for as long as our sun keeps burning, and that will be another several billion years at least. But the wonderful creation of which we are a part is dying. A lot of the most beautiful and most fragile parts of that creation. And to keep our hearts in the work, to not lose heart. How do we keep our stamina up? Well, I thought it was interesting to pursue the concept of thinking of ourselves as hospice workers. It turns out that hospice workers, hospice nurses, have 1/3 or 1/2 the occurrence of significant depression as ICU nurses. Yet their patients live as long or longer than patients in receiving dramatic interventions who start from the same sort of health point. So it's almost Zen that you live longer once you stop trying to live longer. And it's easier on the caregivers as well. And so that's part of the exploration, part of the journey of the book, is to look at these values and think about whether that might give us a little bit more strength as we continue with the necessary work that lies ahead.
How did you avoid becoming a Buddhist in the course of all this?
I am too ingrained in rejecting most mythologies, and also as Roshi Halifax pointed out, all religions are clubs in a sense, and I don't do clubs.
Won't join any club that would have you as a member, yes.
That's right. Groucho Marx and I are on the same wavelength there. Yeah. But I was really interested over time to see that the values in practice of Buddhism are very close to the values of classical Stoicism, the Stoicism of Greece and Rome, which was kind of pushed to the side by the advent of Christianity. But that Stoicism, I think, is well worth people's study.
Julie Trachtenberg has a good question to ask, a prompt. Share the experience you witnessed at the clinic as the women were meeting to receive their hygiene kits.
Oh, the shaming associated with menstruation in that particular part of the world is pretty intense. And one of the things our expedition in 2018 did was to distribute hygiene kits to women, separate from the clinics. These would be separate meetings. And they were among the most energetic and sort of almost raucously celebratory events I have ever been near. And believe me, as a male, I was on the fringes just looking in, but our wonderful leaders, an MD and a nurse in training, Ang Mo Sering, who is actually native to the Dolpo region, they were great celebrities in a sense for having brought just a little bit of appropriate technology into the mix there that freed things up for the women of this particular village in a marvelous and just wonderfully received way.
That must have been incredibly cheering to watch. The backdrop of climate change is it casts such a shadow over things, because unlike hospice care, where one's able to be stoic about one's own self in certain ways, it's hard to be stoic about everything.
Yes.
Going down at once. I mean, you've had to deal with it. I mean, you've been writing about wildlife for a long time, and in the last 50 years, the number of wild animals on the planet has dropped in half.
Yes.
Which is a charnel house of almost unimaginable. I mean, there may be no single statistic on Earth that's more demoralizing than that in some way. How does one square that completely correct sense that a kind of hospice, that impulse is strong and right, with also the strong sense in most of us that resistance is mandatory, and that stoicism is great, but that anger is required as well. I mean, those are not particularly Buddhist ideas, I guess, and there's probably something quite comfortingly stoic about the idea of karma and endless cycles through time and things. But you're a Westerner with as you say, a scientific mindset. How did those two sets of emotions play off in you? How do they play off in you?
Well, I guess first, I don't think Stoicism is not synonymous with being passive, but it's a way of facing adversity. I think in the narrative of the book, for me, the real turning point is an episode titled Sacred Rage, which is a term I borrow from our good friend Terry Tempest Williams. And I think anger is completely appropriate under the circumstances. Rage is appropriate, but where I wind up with that, it has to be a rage that is focused, that it's not a rage that just lets off steam. Rather, it's a rage that focuses steam almost as in the terms of a steam turbine, so that the steam does work, so that it moves things in a proper direction. So I don't subscribe to a philosophy of utter detachment and acceptance. I think we need to be staunch in our willingness to defend our places and to try to correct the misbegotten values of our global society.
Well, the irony, of course, is that, I mean, there's no defense to be made of Nepal in Nepal, at least from climate change.
Right.
The only defense is the moment is to somehow figure out how to get Joe Manchin to do the right thing, or
Right.
I mean, I guess in Virginia they're a little closer to the source. And that seems like it dramatically complicates the already somewhat complicated relationship between arriving in a poor place bearing aid from the Western world. Always a slightly complicated dynamic, but in this case, in a part of the world that's taking it on the chin precisely because of what we're doing or not doing back home. I mean, the US is the 4% of us who live here account for 25% of the world's carbon emissions.
Yeah.
And people in Dolpo account for no percent of
Yes.
the world's carbon emissions.
And in that situation, we can perhaps provide some care, but we can't provide cure. And we must provide care because people need it, and the critters need it, and the land needs it. And as for the Joe Manchins of the world, we are their prisoners. We are in a hostage situation, and we are the hostages. And there's also an extended theme of hope in the book, but not a simple kind of hope. And this is where it gets kind of tricky, because hope means so many things to so many different people. But in the hope, in the book, I try to connect hope to the idea of surprise, that things in the future happen without warning, or with almost no warning, or with no warning that we notice. And things can shift very fast. The fall of the Soviet Union was one such shift. The abolishment of apartheid in South Africa was another shift that came very, very suddenly. The acceptance of gay marriage in the United States, that was revolutionary, and it seemed to happen almost overnight. Not that it really did. The roots were set a long time before, and it took a long time for fruition to come. But where Joe Manchin is concerned, I place my hope, such as it is, in surprise, that something can happen that will turn the conditions of engagement very, very rapidly. And knock wood, maybe that will happen.
Yes, better happen soon, because it was 70 degrees Fahrenheit above normal in the Antarctic the week before last. So,
oh God,
we're cutting it kind of fine here. I mean,
yeah,
that's to use all these medical analogies. That's what's interesting about climate change compared with all those other political shifts we've talked about. Climate change comes with a time limit, and past a certain point, our best efforts will be of not, because no one's got a plan for refreezing the Arctic once it melts,
Yeah.
And that's probably as visible in the Himalayas as any place on the planet. I mean, the just evaporation into the air of these extraordinary glaciers is I mean, people have gone back to look, as to take pictures of, say, the same spots where Mallory took pictures in the first Everest expedition, and now there's 300 feet less vertical ice than there was down in the Valley. That must be. Was your sense that well, what was your sense? You said that people didn't, necessarily blame it on on the same things that science understands to be causing it. But what was your sense about people's or people just accepting that this is what's happening and is going to happen? Is that stoicism in that part of the world extend to just, well, since they can't do anything about it much, we'll have to live with it? Or are people understanding that they may need to be migrating from where they live and so on?
Well, people are already migrating. Kathmandu is now spilling over, more than 1 million people in there. The migration from the rural areas to the various cities has been pronounced, although it reversed a little bit under COVID, because to live in the city, you have to have cash. And when the economy crashed, a lot of people went back to their homes in the villages, to their extended families there. But I don't really know what the deep feeling about the climate shift may be. For so many of those people, life is a day-to-day struggle for subsistence and existence. And I think to some degree, for we sapiens, we have a finite capacity for worry. And if you're worrying about what you're going to eat tomorrow, that kind of pushes away the
Yes.
the meta worries of what's happening to the climate.
Yes.
So those folks are, many of them, not all, but many are living really close to the bone. And yet they see, as we saw on our travel through their country, those panoramas like the one you just suggested, where you can see where the glacier used to come down and it doesn't anymore. And there's this several 100-foot run of really raw earth where a few plants are just beginning to colonize from in where the ice used to dominate. So it's a world of tumult. And they have that trouble, the people there, the same as the people in Paradise, California, have had that feeling of tumult and the known world being erased for them. And that was another climate change catastrophe, the big fire that wiped out that town.
Well, in a sense, it's sort of time breaking in on places that once seemed timeless.
Yeah.
To us. And
although it's a mistake to think that those remote villages were separate from the sort of geopolitical currents of the world, and not least because of the Chinese aggression in Tibet in the late 50s and on through the 60s, which produced a continuous flow of refugees out of Tibet and into Dolpo and other neighboring areas of Nepal.
I was going to ask about that. Do people, is there a sense that the world's other great superpower is just over the next ridge?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And the siren song of a consumer economy, they're feeling it from China. The closer we got to China, and we were very close at times, the more we saw Chinese Coca-Cola cans and beer bottles on the trail, things like that. And if you think about Nepal, its situation, it's like a pearl between two clamshells. One clamshell is China and the other is India. And whatever Nepal does that India likes, China will be mad about. And there is a reverse. There's no easy middle way for Nepal in terms of its foreign affairs.
Speaking of Nepal and of plate tectonics, was this a region that had been hit hard by the earthquake?
No, the big 2015 earthquake was more pronounced to the east in Gorkha and other areas farther east than that. So we were not in that zone. But Nepal knows that another big one is going to come again before long. It's written in the cards.
So have you taken up a new, with the trilogy and I mean, since it was an accidental trilogy, I suppose it could become an accidental 4-part series if you wanted. Have you taken up a new project, and beyond that, what else? Since we're talking about books, what else are you reading now that's getting deep in you?
Well, my grandfather was marginally involved in the Manhattan Project, and I may write a little about him in a fictionalized way. And toward that end, I am reading an absolutely superb book, which you probably know, which is The Making of the Atomic Bomb by Richard Rhodes.
Yes.
Which, when it came out in 1984 or 1986, it won literally every big nonfiction prize. It's a masterwork, and and it's also a blow-by-blow account of the development of nuclear physics in the 20th century, and fascinating from a scientific point of view.
Well, it's interesting that we've talked about that because we've been talking about the shadow of climate change. Of course, its precursor was the shadow of nuclear destruction. And I think it's fair to say that most of us had kind of managed to stick that in the back of our heads in the last couple of decades. And then there it was yesterday morning, Vladimir Putin showing off his new ICBM and saying, let this be food for thought, as he said, for any country that wants to interfere with us. I guess what's interesting to me about all these things, plate tectonics, nuclear weapons, climate change, is that they happen on a scale that's almost unimaginable to us. I mean, it takes our best scientific and then our best literary minds to try and put them in some kind of context that we can even begin to grasp. And I think you've done that spectacularly in this book. But that, I mean, so just talk about scale for a minute. In a sense, the place where you live there, El Valle, has a beautiful, intimate scale to it. Walking down that river to town and through the, but the Himalayas, in my experience, have a scale that's almost other planetary. It's almost too big to. But over 6 weeks and over 2 expeditions, how did that size and that scale grow on you?
I kept thinking about what the first woman to scale El Capitan said to the reporter who shoved a microphone in her mouth at the top of the cliff. And she just said, to eat an elephant, you have to do it one bite at a time. And so every long climb, every high pass, I just kept thinking, this is eating an elephant. But this question of scale is, I think, fundamental to our time on the planet now. And that is, we have the scale of our lives, what we can measure and see, and the distance we can walk in a day, the distance we can go in our lifetime. And then to understand our place in the universe, we also have to think in terms of geological time, hundreds of millions of years, billions of years. And now, as we approach the hard truths of climate change, we're going to see numbers that are like geological numbers of years in terms of the number of refugees, the number of displaced people, the calculations of damage in dollars or yen or euros or you name it. So this is something that I think all of us are challenged to do, and that is to learn to think at multiple scales, and to avoid errors of scale. One of the errors of scale I hear all the time is that, well, Earth is going to produce species forever and ever, and so it doesn't matter that we're exterminating so many now. That's an error of scale. That's mixing human time with geologic time, and I reject that out of hand.
Yes, it does seem. I mean, that seems like backing up too far. Like,
Yeah,
you don't really have to worry about anything if you insist that, well, the sun's going to blow up in 1 billion years, so what difference does any of it all make anyhow?
right.
That seems a little too stoic. I mean, we were born into a world with a lot of friends, a great suite of flora and fauna that marked the late Pleistocene, and it does seem worth a life's work to try and protect what of it we can. And one of the interesting parts of that discussion of scale for individuals is discussion of age. I'm thinking about it a lot now because we're doing this work organizing older Americans for action on climate change. Useful because there's a lot of us, 70 million. We vote like crazy, and we ended up with most of the money. So if we're going to pressure Washington or Wall Street, it's probably going to be useful to have some people of a certain age. But it's also just made me think a little more about aging and societies, and what was your sense? What was your sense around aging in Nepal and in those communities? What was your sense of how older people thought of themselves and were thought of in their communities?
Well, as in most traditional communities in the Tibetan, Nepal, Tibetan communities we're in, elders were revered. And they were also vigorous. And that underscored for me, I mean, I was in my late 60s when I made those 2 trips. And I just kept saying, the only way as you age to keep going is to keep going. Movement is its own solution. And I'll just say, I so much admire what you're doing with Third Act. And I want you to know I've signed up. I'm on the roster. I think, we Americans of our age are blessed with, for the most part, really great health for people of our age, high levels of energy. And as you say, we get to a point where we don't have to work for the dollar as much as we used to. We need to put our shoulders to the wheel and keep grinding away at the changes that the world needs. Amen. So kudos to you for founding Third Act.
Amen. It's funny, there's a question here in the chat box for me about Asia, and particularly about some writing I've done in the past about Kerala in India, down in the lowlands. I've spent a lot of time in India, including up in the border of Tibet, and in that very wild and interesting country up there, where not many people get to go. But I also did spend a long time in Kerala, down in the very tip of India and the southern border, because it was interesting for me for socio-political reasons. Remarkable place, poor, like even poorer than much of the rest of India, but with a life expectancy and a literacy rate and better or equal or better than America's, and hence, living decent lives on a tiny fraction of the resources and a tiny fraction of the damage that we're managing to do. And one of the things that was very powerful there was the understanding of just how important the early liberation of women had been in making that happen in that culture. It had been a matrilineal Hindu caste that dominated that part of India, and it was just remarkable to sense. There were also very strong currents from Gandhi's movement that pushed through there and left powerful, lasting change. But it is, for me, it was the beginning 30 years ago, I think, of breaking down my idea that Americans, I think, are inherit that everybody wants to be like us, and that we've discovered the secret to living successfully on planet Earth. Now that seems, ridiculous. In the wake of the Trump years, why anybody would want to be like us is open for quite, but I think that's a deep question that underlies all travels that we take out of the rich world into the rest of the world, and it's one of the things that I really love about the road to Kanjiroba, because it grapples a lot with that kind of what we would now call the white savior complex out, the medical missionaries out. So instead, one's left, and since we're at the end of the hour, this is a good place to end it. One's left with a very beautiful and moving and deeply human idea of just people making connections, and those connections being based in affection and a kind of pleasure in each other's company that runs very deep and has little to do with the way that that a consumer society encourages us to make connections. So leave us with one. I'm going to tell people in advance that to say thanks for joining us, and to despite my remarks about the consumer society, to remind them to buy a copy of your book from your local bookstore, because local bookstores are great hubs of community and we desperately need them going. But leave us with one last story from the trip that gives some sense of just what it felt like to be there.
Well, perhaps the most moving moment of the entire trip, of either trip, for me, was the act of foot washing. We needed to wash the feet of our patients before they went to the acupuncture tent. And at one point I was washing the feet of a Tibetan peasant woman. There was a commotion behind us. Everyone's attention went away. But that woman and I was holding her foot, and we locked eyes. And for a moment, she let me into the depths of her eyes, and I tried to reciprocate. And that moment of connection across language and culture and time and geography and just human to human, warm hand to warm hand, or warm foot, as it were, that stays with me. I see her in my mind's eye all the time, and it warms my heart.
And that's a beautiful connection because it crosses religious traditions too. Foot washing has a lot of resonance, and it's. I won't forget soon that the first thing that the remarkable Pope Francis did the first day he took his office was wash the feet of Muslim prisoners in Rome.
Yeah.
Bill, thank you for this book. Thank you for all your books. Thank you for your incredible witness. And thanks to everybody who joined us here today, and especially the people at the Festival of the Book. Go to vabook.org. You can look at all the past events like this that there have been, and you can anticipate all the future ones that are coming. It's good to live in the world, and it's good to get to live in books sometimes too. Thank you, brother. Have a nice day in the Sangre de Cristo, and greetings from the Green Mountains.
Wonderful to be with you, Bill. Thank you so much.